Rachel Hoffman was a young woman with big dreams. She grew up in a fairly well-off family in Tallahassee, Florida, and has shown great promise since childhood. Education at a prestigious school, admission to the University of Florida, everything said that Rachel had a bright future ahead of her. However, the life of a young student ended in tragedy when Rachel became involved in the dangerous world of drugs. Rachel was the only child of her parents. She has been surrounded by love and care since childhood. Rachel's parents were not only successful professionals, but also attentive educators who always tried to instill in their daughter the importance of education, honesty, and the pursuit of success. From an early age, Rachel showed an interest in studying and music. She was attracted to the opportunity to express herself through creativity, and her parents supported her in this. During her school years, she participated in various clubs, performed on stage, and had many friends. Her cheerfulness and energy attracted the attention of others to her, and she quickly gained sympathy among both peers and teachers. Rachel was not just a talented but also a purposeful child. Her dream was to get an education and build a career that would allow her to help others. She was interested in psychology and considered working in this field. In high school, she showed an interest in working with children and volunteering, helping to organize events and participating in charity events. When it came time to go to college, Rachel chose Florida State University. This choice seemed ideal to her. The university had a good program that allowed her to develop her interests in psychology and social work. For Rachel, it was a new stage in her life, full of hope and opportunity. She dreamed of one day becoming a professional capable of changing people's lives for the better. However, college life was not as easy as she had expected. Moving to a new city, adapting to new conditions, new friends, all this led to changes in her life. Rachel, always cheerful and sociable, sought to find her place in a new environment, and this desire gradually drew her into a circle of people who were far from her previous ideals. Although at first glance it seemed that Rachel had easily adapted to student life, internally she felt vulnerable and sometimes lonely. The new social circle brought with it not only parties and entertainment, but also acquaintances with people who were involved in the drug trade. Rachel Hoffman grew up in a family that always set high goals for itself and expected great achievements from it. Rachel's parents were successful, hardworking people, and they instilled in their daughter a love of knowledge and a desire for self-improvement. Rachel was an intelligent and purposeful girl, and from an early age showed interest in studying, creativity, and new hobbies. However, like many teenagers, in college Rachel began to look for her place in the world, and people with whom she could find a common language. Being in college gave her more freedom than she had ever had. At some point, Rachel began spending time with a group of students who were involved in partying and drug use. It didn't seem like something dangerous to her, rather, a way to relax and get away from everyday problems. Rachel has always been sociable and friendly. She easily got along with people. Her new friends were attractive for their apparent carelessness and the opportunity to have quick pleasures, which helped Rachel forget about the stress associated with school and personal problems. She started smoking marijuana and soon realized that it had become a part of her new life. At first it seemed harmless: parties, relaxing atmosphere, new acquaintances. However, over time, Rachel began to realize that some of her new friends were connected to more dangerous aspects of this life. They not only used drugs, but also sold them to ensure their constant access to them. Rachel was cautious at first, but soon she found herself drawn into this world. She was offered drugs in exchange for money or small favors, and she began to take part in more risky business. At some point, this became the norm, and Rachel stopped realizing how deeply she was plunging into this dark side of life. Her former interests and dreams of the future began to fade into the background. Diving into the world of drugs and risky dating has overshadowed her former self-confidence and her path. Gradually, Rachel began to realize that her new life could lead to serious consequences, but by that time she was already too deeply involved in this social circle. Her friends knew that Rachel was an educated and intelligent girl, and they used her trust and thirst for new experiences to involve her in things that she could not even imagine at first. Gradually, Rachel began to realize that her life was changing for the worse, but fear of the consequences and the danger of breaking up with these people kept her from leaving this circle. Ultimately, her involvement in the world of drugs and risky transactions was the beginning of a tragic chain of events that led her to a fatal encounter with the police, and subsequently to her tragic death. Rachel Hoffman's arrest was a turning point in her life that turned her world upside down. That day, she found herself in a situation she could never have thought of before. A life full of ambition and hope was suddenly threatened by her mistakes and wrong decisions. Rachel was arrested in the spring of 2008. Her arrest took place at her apartment in Tallahassee, Florida. At that time, Rachel had been in touch with people involved in the sale of drugs for several months. These were mostly light drugs, such as marijuana, which she kept for personal use and sometimes distributed to acquaintances. However, these connections gradually drew her deeper into a dangerous world that she herself was not yet fully aware of. The arrest occurred after police raided her apartment and found a significant amount of drugs. The police initially came with a search warrant, suspecting Rachel of drug possession. When they entered her apartment, Rachel was stunned and scared. She did not expect that her actions would lead to such serious consequences. The police found about 150 grams of marijuana in her possession, as well as ecstasy pills and prescription drugs that did not belong to Rachel. These findings became the basis for serious charges of drug possession and distribution. She was detained and taken to a police station, where she was charged. It was a shock to Rachel. She was aware that she was in serious trouble, and she understood that her future was in danger. Her actions, which she considered harmless, led to the fact that her life began to collapse rapidly. The future she had been building for so long began to seem unattainable to her. At the police station, Rachel was in a state of panic. She was trying to figure out what was threatening her and was looking for ways to get out of this situation. During the interrogation, she spoke about her connections with people involved in drugs and admitted her guilt. However, she also expressed her willingness to cooperate with the police, hoping that this would help mitigate her punishment. The police, realizing that they had a young girl with extensive connections in drug circles on their hands, saw Rachel as an opportunity to carry out operational work. They offered her a deal in exchange for information and help in catching larger drug traffickers. They were willing to mitigate her charges. Rachel, realizing that she had little choice, agreed to this proposal. For the police, Rachel became a potential informant who could help them infiltrate the drug network with which she was connected. For Rachel, it was a chance to escape harsh punishment and try to correct her mistakes. She hoped that this collaboration would allow her to get out of the dangerous world into which she was drawn and start her life with a clean slate. However, this decision led to tragic consequences that no one could have imagined. A young woman who once dreamed of a bright future found herself involved in an operation that became deadly for her. This proposal seemed to her the only chance to avoid serious problems with the law, and she decided to cooperate with the authorities. Rachel hoped that she would be able to complete this mission quickly and return to normal life. But she didn't even know how dangerous this path could be. When Rachel Hoffman was arrested for marijuana possession, her parents, Jane and Peter Hoffman, were shocked and perplexed. At that time, they could not yet imagine the scale of the problems they would face. The reaction of the parents was complex and multifaceted, covering a wide range of emotions. When Jane and Peter first found out about Rachel's arrest, they were in complete shock. They couldn't believe that their daughter was involved in such an offense. Marijuana, although legalized in some states, was still considered a drug, and the fact that Rachel was in such a situation was difficult for them to perceive. At first, they couldn't figure out how this could happen. They recalled her past, her achievements, and how she had always been disciplined and single-minded. This contradiction between how they saw her and what happened was too much of a blow. As the situation unfolded, Jane and Peter began to feel a deep sense of guilt. They asked themselves if there was any way they could have prevented this incident. Questions like maybe we didn't notice something important, or maybe we weren't paying enough attention tormented them. This guilt was accompanied by anxiety about Rachel's future. They were concerned about how the arrest and trial might affect her life and future. It was important for them to understand how they could support their daughter in this difficult moment and what needs to be done to help her cope with the consequences of her arrest. Gradually, after the initial shock, Jane and Peter began to realize that they needed to support Rachel. Despite the fact that they felt disappointed and worried, they decided to actively participate in her trial, trying to help her daughter. When Rachel was offered a deal in exchange for a reduced sentence, she agreed to cooperate with the police. It was a chance for her to escape prison and try to get her life back on track. However, being new to this business, Rachel did not fully realize what dangers might lie ahead. The police provided her with instructions on what she had to do. She was supposed to act as a buyer of a large shipment of drugs and weapons. Rachel was given $13,000 in cash, which she was supposed to use for the deal, and she was also equipped with listening devices so that the police could monitor her movements and ensure her safety. Unfortunately, the preparation for the operation turned out to be insufficient. Despite the fact that Rachel was given listening devices, she was not trained how to behave properly in such a situation. The police did not provide her with adequate protection, such as shelter or escorting operatives. They were counting on Rachel to be able to cope on her own, unaware. The operation itself was scheduled for May 7, 2008. Rachel was supposed to meet with two drug dealers, Andre Green and Denzello Bradley, to make a purchase of drugs and weapons. The meeting was scheduled on a deserted road on the outskirts of Tallahassee, which in itself made the operation risky. It all started according to plan. Rachel went to the meeting in her car, taking with her the money and the instructions given to her by the police. The police officers monitoring the operation were some distance away, but were not close enough to intervene in case of a threat. When Rachel arrived at the scene, Green and Bradley were already waiting for her. She handed over the money to them, and according to the plan, the deal was supposed to go through quickly and without complications. However, something went wrong. The criminals probably suspected that Rachel might be working for the police. They suddenly forced her to get into their car instead of their own, and drove away from the meeting place. The police lost contact with Rachel almost immediately after she was in the criminal's car. The listening devices did not transmit a signal, and the police did not know where she was or what was happening to her. Over the next few hours, they tried to reconnect, but to no avail. Green and Bradley took Rachel to a wooded area far from the original meeting place. There they took her out of the car, tied her up and forced her to kneel. Despite her pleas for mercy, the criminals were not going to leave any witnesses. They shot her, leaving her body in a remote area where they thought no one would be able to find it. It was a cruel and unexpected death for Rachel. A young woman who hoped for salvation and a new life died as a result of an unsuccessful operation that was organized with gross security violations. Her death was a terrible outcome of the events that began with her arrest and ended on a deserted road in the forest. After the connection with Rachel was lost, the police began searching the area where the deal was supposed to take place. They were counting on being able to quickly locate her, or at least traces of where she might have been taken. However, nothing was found at the meeting place that could give them a clue. Time passed, and every minute increased the risk that Rachel might already be dead. The police have launched several search teams, including both police officers and volunteers. At the same time, active work was underway to track the movements of suspects who may have been involved in the kidnapping. Realizing that the situation was getting out of control, law enforcement agencies turned to other departments and services, including federal agents, for help. A breakthrough in the investigation occurred when investigators gained access to surveillance footage installed on roads adjacent to the meeting place. Watching the video footage allowed them to determine the route Green and Bradley took after they took Rachel into their car. This data turned out to be crucial in the search. One of the key moments was the discovery of a recording in which the suspected car turned off the main road into a wooded area far from the city. This direction immediately aroused the suspicions of investigators, as the area was sparsely populated and ideally suited to hide the traces of a crime. The search operation for Rachel moved to a wooded area, where Green and Bradley were supposed to have taken her. Additional police forces were sent to the area, including dog handlers with dogs specially trained to search for bodies. This place was far from the city, and the road there was difficult to access, which complicated the search. The search in the forest lasted several hours. The dense vegetation and difficult terrain made it difficult to move, but the police were determined to find Rachel. The investigators carefully combed every meter of the ground, and eventually their efforts were rewarded. Rachel Hoffman's body was found deep in the woods, partially covered by branches and foliage. At the scene of her death, the police found clear signs of violent death. Rachel was shot, her hands were tied, and there were signs of abuse on her body. The discovery of Rachel's body came as a shock to everyone involved in the operation. The police officers who worked with her were devastated to realize that they had failed to ensure her safety. Criminologists immediately arrived at the scene of the discovery to collect all possible evidence that could help in further investigation. After the discovery of Rachel Hoffman's body, the police focused their efforts on catching the perpetrators of her murder. There was already information about the suspects Andre Green and Derek Bradley, who participated in a failed operation to buy drugs and weapons. The task of the police now was to gather enough evidence and locate the perpetrators to apprehend them. Police immediately began analyzing all available data to link Green and Bradley to the murder. Among the first steps was to conduct an examination of the place where Rachel's body was found. Tire tracks, fragments of clothing, and other evidence that could point to the perpetrators were found at the crime scene. Phone records and cell tower data were also examined, which helped establish the suspect's travel routes on the night of the murder. Investigators turned to databases on the movement of cars to confirm that the car recorded on surveillance cameras belonged to one of the suspects. The police interviewed Rachel's friends and colleagues to establish what might have been going on before her death. These conversations provided additional information about the nature of Rachel and Green's relationship with Bradley, and also confirmed that they were the last people to see her alive. The key element was the testimony of a witness who saw a suspicious car near a wooded area on the day of Rachel's disappearance. This made it possible to identify the vehicle and once again confirm the connection between the suspects and the crime scene. After collecting sufficient evidence and confirming their authenticity, the police issued arrest warrants for Green and Bradley. A special operation was organized to detain them, in which employees of several law enforcement agencies participated. Green was detained in one of his shelters, the apartment where he was hiding after the murder. Bradley, having learned about the capture of an accomplice, tried to escape, but was detained on the highway leading out of the city. Both suspects were arrested without the use of force, and they were immediately taken to the police station for questioning. During the interrogations, Green and Bradley initially denied their guilt, but under the pressure of the collected evidence and after a series of cross-examinations, they began to testify. They didn't expect things to go this way. What should have been a simple transaction turned into a nightmare. Andre Green and Derek Bradley, criminals who have been engaged in illegal activities for a long time, are not used to surprises. They were always careful and relied on their experience to avoid problems. But this time it got out of control. When Andre and Derek received information about a girl who wanted to buy drugs and weapons from them, they didn't pay much attention to it. Rachel seemed to them like an ordinary customer, another naive student who decided to try something new and dangerous. But they didn't know that she was a police informant, and that the whole operation was organized to catch them red-handed. The meeting was scheduled for the evening, in a secluded place on the outskirts of the city. They chose a quiet street, away from prying eyes. Andre and Derek arrived at the place a little earlier, as always, to make sure that everything was calm and nothing threatened their plans. Rachel arrived alone, which immediately aroused their suspicions. Usually such transactions took place quickly, without unnecessary conversations. But something was wrong this time. She was nervous, and it was noticeable. Andre and Derek looked at each other. It didn't look like an ordinary deal. When Rachel got out of the car, she started looking around, which made them even more wary. However, despite their doubts, they started a deal. The moment she handed over the money, Derek noticed something strange in her behavior. He suddenly realized that they could be framed. In an instant, panic gripped both of them. Andre abruptly drew his weapon and pointed it at Rachel. Derek began to demand an explanation, but she remained silent, afraid to say something superfluous. At that moment, they realized that they had fallen into a trap. They couldn't let Rachel leave and tell anyone what had happened. "You're an informant, aren't you?" Derek asked furiously. Rachel tried to deny it, but her fear spoke for itself. Realizing that she couldn't be trusted, they made a decision from which there was no turning back. They knew that if they let her go, they would be behind bars for years to come. In their world, mistakes are not forgiven. Andre and Derek, two men hardened in a life of crime, did what they knew best: got rid of the problem. Andre was the first to attack Rachel, strangling her with his hands. She tried to resist, but the forces were unequal. Derek, realizing that he could not let the witness stay alive, joined the attack. Together they ended her life. They were shocked by what they had done, but they understood that they needed to act quickly. They grabbed her body and hurriedly loaded it into the car. They needed to get rid of the evidence. Andre and Derek knew they couldn't leave Rachel's body where it would be easily found. They knew a secluded place outside the city where they could bury her and hide her tracks. In the dead of night, when the city was asleep, they took her there. The place they chose was abandoned and empty. They dug the grave, quickly but deep enough that no one could find it. Rachel's body was wrapped in a blanket that they found in the trunk of her car. They threw dirt and debris into the pit, trying to make everything as inconspicuous as possible. Back at home, Andre and Derek tried to act as if nothing had happened. They burned the clothes they were wearing that night, erased all traces that could have given them away. But something inside has already changed. They knew that the police would come out to them sooner or later, but they didn't know how soon it would happen. Within days of the murder, news of Rachel's disappearance began to appear in the media. Andre and Derek began to feel the pressure the fear of being discovered was getting the better of them. They did everything possible to escape and not fall into the hands of the police, but they realized that their time was limited. After the arrests of Andre Green and Derek Bradley, the case quickly gained momentum. The public was shocked by the brutal murder of a young girl, and pressure on law enforcement agencies increased. Police and prosecutors sought to ensure justice for Rachel Hoffman and her family. When the trial began, defense lawyers tried to justify their clients' actions with fear and panic, arguing that Andre and Derek acted impulsively, believing that their lives were at risk. However, the judge and the jury did not accept this argument. The prosecution presented irrefutable evidence of premeditated murder. The trial lasted several weeks. The prosecutor's office presented a lot of evidence, including phone records, eyewitness accounts, as well as physical evidence found at the crime scene. The testimony of law enforcement officers who were involved in the operation added weight to the accusation. Defense lawyers, in turn, tried to mitigate the punishment, arguing that their clients acted in a state of passion, afraid of exposure. They were trying to prove that Rachel had not presented herself as a police informant, which allegedly caused Andre and Derek to feel threatened. However, the jury had no doubts. The evidence of the premeditation of the defendant's actions was more than convincing. The prosecutor stressed that Rachel did not threaten them, and that the murder was cold and calculated. The judge upheld this opinion, calling Andre and Derek's actions a cruel and heartless crime. The jury did not delay in reaching a verdict. They found Andre Green and Derek Bradley guilty of premeditated murder in the first degree. The verdict was a fair decision that satisfied Rachel's family and the public. The judge pronounced the sentence with maximum severity. Both defendants were sentenced to life in prison without the right to parole. This decision underlined that justice has been served and that violent crimes will be severely punished. The judge also noted that, despite the youth of the accused, their actions showed how cold-blooded they were. Rachel Hoffman's death at the hands of criminals during an unsuccessful undercover police operation has caused significant consequences, both for her family and for society as a whole. These consequences encompass both personal and societal aspects, and they have greatly influenced law enforcement and public perception of policing. For Rachel's parents, Jane and Peter Hoffman, her death was a profound blow. Not only did they lose their daughter, but they also faced additional suffering due to the circumstances of her death. This tragic incident changed their lives forever, and they were forced to cope with grief and emotional pain. Jane and Peter actively began to fight for justice, demanding an investigation into the circumstances of their daughter's death and criticism of police actions. They sought to ensure that the mistakes made during the operation were recognized and corrected. This struggle included attracting public attention, cooperating with human rights organizations, and participating in rallies and campaigns. As a result of their activism, Rachel's parents have become public figures in discussing the problems of police practice. This brought attention to their case and helped change public opinion about conducting undercover operations. They used their platform to highlight issues related to the security and rights of participants. The case of Rachel Hoffman has drawn attention to the problems associated with undercover operations and the safety of police operations in general. The society has become more aware of the potential risks and disadvantages of such operations. This has led to a broader discussion of the need for reforms in law enforcement agencies and increased transparency of police actions. Rachel's tragedy inspired human rights organizations to become more involved in reforming police practices. These organizations have begun to work on the creation and implementation of standards and recommendations aimed at improving security and human rights during undercover operations. As a result of the tragedy, law enforcement agencies have become more attentive to the control and supervision of undercover operations. A monitoring and verification system has been introduced, which includes more thorough training and ensuring the safety of all participants in operations. New policies and new protocols have been developed and implemented to regulate undercover operations. These protocols are aimed at preventing situations in which participants in operations may be in danger. New requirements have been established to ensure the safety and protection of the rights of all participants. In response to criticism and public pressure, law enforcement agencies began to strive for more transparent undercover operations. Measures have been implemented to improve the reporting and provision of information on such operations so that the public can monitor their progress. The tragic death of Rachel Hoffman has stirred up the public and sparked extensive discussions about police practices, especially in the context of undercover operations. This tragedy was not only a personal loss for the Hoffman family, but also a significant signal of the need for changes in law enforcement.